Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Father Charles Trujols. I'm the director here of the Catholic Information Center, and I want to welcome all of you who are present here through the live stream. We are here in Washington, D.C., I like to say, in the belly of the beast, downtown D.C., with the Catholic outpost here, trying to bring Christ downtown and spiritual and nourishment formation to all of us. It's so needed for our professions, for our lives. And we have daily mass here at the CIC. We have the bookstore. We have so many events like this one. And today, I am pleased to have the book launch written by Leah Libresco Sargeant, who works on family policy in Washington, D.C. Her newest book is The Dignity of Dependence. Leah has also, she has previously authored Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She's a contributing writer for The Dispatch and the Institute for Family Studies. And her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, First Things, The Lamp, and elsewhere. She runs the Substack Other Feminisms, a Substack community focused on advocating for women in a world that makes an idol of autonomy. She's a mother of three, and she's also a DC Leonine Fellow. Her husband, Alexi, is also a writer, and we have her book also here on our bookstore, Saintly Creatures, and it's been also a great hit for a children's book. Anyway, so I want to help me to welcome Leah Libresco Sargeant.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here at the CIC. And I am running an informal competition about which book event will have the most babies at it. So if you have brought a baby, would you please raise your hand? And if you have brought twins, just raise 2 hands. I see at least 3 babies, so you're putting up very solid numbers, and I will update you when the full tour is over on which city won. Please don't worry if your baby makes noise during the talk. I'm from New York originally. I am much louder. My book, The Dignity of Dependence, A Feminist Manifesto, is comprised of a set of words, each of which I was counseled against including in the title at various times, each of which I was told would alienate someone, whether it be dignity, dependence, feminist, or manifesto, though at least manifesto is a warning about the other 3. And so I'd like to begin by talking about what may be the most controversial of those words for this audience, feminist. Why do I say that this book is a feminist book, specifically, a feminist project? I think feminism at its core, obviously a contested movement over time, but at its core is about responding justly to women as women, not women as neutral human beings, a kind of being who has never existed in all of human history up till this point, but as women. Not women as defective men, but distinctively women with our own particular needs in justice. And my contention in this book is that women's equality is not premised and cannot be premised on our interchangeability with men. I think it's that mindset that turns up in various waves of the feminist movement, various ways to attempt to help women get over the hump of not being men by finding better ways to pass as men. And you can kind of look and say, well, obviously we aren't fully interchangeable with men. There are some differences, some more or less dramatic, more or less morally valenced. I think my favorite completely trivial difference between men and women is not even height, which is one of those cases where you see those overlapping bell curves move a little further apart. Come on in. It's grip strength. Men and women are perhaps most easily distinguished for anything we do in fact overlap on grip strength, where 90% of women have weaker grip strength than all but 95% of men. So the 2 bell curves are pretty far apart. And this is the kind of difference between men and women I think it feels safe to acknowledge. Because even though this is true, I don't think almost anyone, maybe barring a few trolls on Twitter, say, and this is why we have to repeal the 19th Amendment. But when we look at other differences between men and women, we see that they become a little more threatening, a little faster. I like the example of the WNBA, which has to decide what does it mean for women's basketball to exist on parity with men's basketball. I'm not going to touch the salary dispute here. I actually mean something a little more straightforward. Should the hoop for women be lower than the hoop for men? Is what's fair a hoop that's equivalently hard to dunk on when women are shorter, or is it a hoop that's exactly the same height? This has actually been particularly controversial when it comes to the three-point line. I think that's partly because you can see the difference. When colleges, as they have in the past, have two different three-point lines for their men and women's team based on their regulations for their different leagues, everyone who steps on the court, whether playing on the men or the women's team, can see there are two lines. And it's made people extremely uncomfortable to the point where it's been rolled back to have women play from the men's line. And that's because women felt they were split. The players were split, but a number of women felt as long as people could see women weren't playing the exact same game, women couldn't make the case for being treated equally as players. If the line was a little closer, even if that made it equally hard to shoot, it wasn't the same game, couldn't be treated with the same respect. And I think descriptively, they're right to worry. I think it is often the case that acknowledging differences between the sexes feels profoundly dangerous, precisely because we rely in an increasingly pluralistic and secular society on the crude measure of interchangeability to make the case for equality. If I don't know that you share my premises on what gives dignity to men or women, the easiest way for us to meet is we say, well, I think we can agree they're equally dignified because they are basically the same. And everything that testifies against that sameness puts women's equality in jeopardy. Now, the basketball one is, I think a little more heated. Certainly some very strong words have been exchanged over it versus grip strength. But as a non-basketball player, it doesn't actually have that much force on my own life. I think there are other differences between men and women that we find it harder to sidestep or cover up. You can put the three-point line at the same place as the men's, and all you're doing is making it a little harder to shoot. But there are other ways the physical differences between men and women play a role in our lives that are a lot harder to compromise on. One of the experiences I bet a number of folks in this room have had experience with is just the way that if you share a car with your spouse, you probably have had the experience of getting into the driver's seat and either cranking it all the way back or cranking the seat all the way forward so that either the husband or wife can reach the pedals comfortably. Now, the problem with this isn't just that it's tedious to move the seat back and forth. It's that airbags are designed assuming the person sitting in the driver's seat is sitting back at a male typical distance. And so, when women scrunch the seat forward, most of the time on ride after ride, it's not a problem besides the actual moving of the seat. But then when you get into an accident and the airbag goes off and it expects to kind of come to a halt and cushion you 3 or 4 inches further back than you actually are, it hits women's chests with a lot more explosive force because it hasn't reached the end of its expansion. And as a result, women in minor car accidents are much more likely to be sent to the hospital with broken ribs or pierced lungs than men are, because there is essentially a bomb that is aimed at your chest and that isn't calibrated for the actual distance you're sitting behind the bomb. And there's been a lot of efforts to figure out, what can we do about this? Some very short women petitioned the US government for the ability to turn off their airbags, thinking they were safer without them than with something that they were so close to at the maximum expansive force. And a safety regulator in Europe said, obviously this was very sad, but it was also very hard to solve and wasn't really the car maker's problem at all. And what he said was you can't really expect us to deal with this. He said, females are slightly weaker and women sitting closer can be an issue. That can be an issue. It's not an issue for him, obviously. It's an issue for the women. But I think we see in place after place this kind of accusation leveled at women, that women are simply too fragile and too close. And we're fragile and close in a way that other people can't possibly be expected to accommodate. The act of being a woman in the world is, an interesting hobby, I suppose, but, to some extent, it's every individual woman's problem to bridge the gap between herself and the way the world is prepared to receive her. That's a European regulator. Back across the pond in the United States, I think we see a different way that America has responded to the problem of women being too exposed and too close that has a very different set of victims. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, long before Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, never thought abortion should be a matter of a constitutional appeal to privacy, which she thought was a weird and muddled way to make this case. She thought the strongest grounds for a claim to a right to abortion was on equal protection under the law grounds. That to a very real extent, it would be hard for women to be treated as equal citizens under the law if they were not essentially equivalent, interchangeable with men. And that abortion was a way of restoring that equality when the differences and asymmetries in reproduction had robbed women of that equal stature. What she and others argued is that when there is an unexpected pregnancy, men and women biologically have very different capacities to walk away. For a man to abandon a baby he has fathered requires only cowardice. He has to disappear, leave no forwarding address, but it's just a matter of running. For a woman to separate herself from her baby cannot be done as a mere act of the will. It requires an act of violence. It requires lethal drugs or a surgeon's scalpel to sever the connection that she and her baby inhabit. And for Ginsburg, she argued that essentially the strong asymmetry between men and women here made it hard for women to be treated as equal citizens, made it hard for women to make their case under employment law, that they could be treated the same way as a male worker. Essentially, the way she framed it is that abortion is the entry price for being an equal citizen in America. You must be this able to walk away from your responsibilities to be able to ride the rides. Now, where she and I agree is I think she's descriptively correct. That is the expectation we place on women. To some extent, it's even the expectation we place on men, that obviously a man would choose to walk away when things were hard, when a baby is disabled, when some constraint or thing that's asked of him is too much for him to easily bear. But I just don't think helping women reach an equality of vice with men is a real vote for the equal dignity of women. I said one of the provocative words on this book is feminist, but one of the other ones is dependence. And I was counseled several times, does it have to say dependence? Can't it say mutuality or sharing or something else? Because dependence is bad. How could it be dignified to be dependent? And I think that's a common objection. That's why it's on the cover, to warn you that the book will make you uncomfortable, that I'm arguing for a revaluing of values. Because when we look at the arguments made about the baby, about why the baby isn't a human person, they often start with the baby's dependence. And there can even be an instinct within the pro-life movement that the way we get over this embarrassment, that the baby indeed is dependent, does need the mother, is to kind of appeal to what the baby does have. Did you know, after this many weeks, the baby can hear you? Did you know the baby can sense light and darkness from outside the womb? Did you know, in Juno, that your baby has fingernails? Fingernails aren't quite autonomy, but they're a gesture towards the autonomous walking around person this baby will one day be. And I understand why people make those pitches in kind of moments of extremity to get someone to consider that there is a person, not just a blood reading or a shadowy image in there. But I was very moved when I read O. Carter Snead's What It Means to Be Human, because instead of analogizing the baby to its mother, this baby is almost as good as a woman, he analogized the mother to the baby. He said, part of what we always have to remember is that the baby is desperately needy, and the mother is made needy by the way her child depends on her, by the things it requires from her body, by the way her own strength is diverted to serve the baby's needs. And I think it's very unusual to ground a dignity claim in that way. To compare someone to a baby is usually viewed as insulting. Our word for it is infantilizing. And when I say, I really admired the way that O. Carter Snead infantilized women in his pro-life appeal, technically I've said that on YouTube now, and I guess he'll be in trouble when someone clips it. But we view it as an insult because we think it is, to some degree, disgraceful to be a baby. To some degree, that being a baby is something that can cast you out of the human family if you are a baby in utero or if you are a baby who is unwanted. But dependence is not a temporary embarrassment that we all get over in our infancy and gradually learn to walk and to talk and to feed ourselves and eventually graduate to autonomy. Dependence is the pattern of our human life. Every single person, including you, little guy or girl back there, starts our life utterly dependent on one woman in particular. And although American law began its abortion jurisprudence around the viability line, when could a baby survive outside the womb, that's still just a question of when could the baby survive dependent on someone other than his or her mother. Because a baby delivered is not a viable baby in any meaningful sense. They need to be fed, need to be held, need to be changed. They require immense sacrifice and love, but it can be from a broader range of people and not from their original birth parents. So dependent for infancy, dependent for somewhat of childhood, but then eventually, I guess, longer dependent now that we're pushing off adulting to like the mid-20s, but eventually, gloriously, an adult, not dependent on anyone, preferably male, so that every day you can walk with total confidence that no one is bodily dependent on you that you don't know about. All of your ties are chosen ties, or at the very least, they're ones you're aware of. So the peak of human existence, walking around as, let's say, a 32-year-old guy who is unmarried, so not exposed to his wife's need, whose parents are currently well, he's not exposed to their need, and whose siblings are all relatively stable. And if we kind of consider what the best version of human life is from the point of view of seeing the core of human life as this experience of autonomy, then I suppose like we celebrate this young man as he gets hit by a bus at 32, maybe 38, depending on how you feel about the issues he's having with his back, cut down in his prime, great work, a full, vibrant human life. It sounds absurd when you state it that way, but it's the logic that's increasingly creeping out as we see the expansion of euthanasia, particularly in Canada, but in country after country, that takes as its assumption that not all human lives are fully human and therefore not worth living. That as that 32-year-old man becomes exposed to others' needs and eventually, once again, needs his diapers changed himself, he has to some degree lost his hold on what it means to be a human being in society with others, and might prefer to make his quietus, if not with a bare bodkin, than with a surgeon, with his doctor's prescription. And we see when we look at the US, at the states that have legalized euthanasia, that the most commonly cited reasons for seeking medical aid in dying are not questions of pain. They're questions of embarrassment. Questions of, I don't want to burden my family, as one of the most commonly cited reasons for seeking suicide at a doctor's hands. Questions of, I don't feel dignified going on this way. This is something we catechize each other into day by day, moment by moment. It's very hard to have a society that says that children are non-persons when they depend so utterly on others, and then assert the dignity of the elderly when they are dependent in exactly the same way on a broader suite of people without any one mother responsible for them at that time. It is very hard to disvalue the disabled, to talk openly about rationing care during a pandemic based on whether or not someone has Down syndrome, and then make the case that elderly lives are worth living. Piece by piece, we kind of chip off parts of human life from a full, flourishing human life in the womb. For bits of infancy, though we kind of grant it to you on sufferance because you'll probably graduate, across the scope of life and disability, large swaths of pregnancy when you're not able to do everything you once did, and then at the end of life. And what you look at the end of that is just this thin patchwork of a human life, almost as though you were a swimmer drowning, where you only bob your head above that waterline of autonomy occasionally. And to be honest, it's easiest to do during the period where you love the fewest people. Because even when you yourself are strongest, when you are exposed to the needs of others, your own autonomy becomes fragile because someone is capable of interrupting you, of making large claims on you that will blow up other parts of your life to be able to answer properly. I don't think this is a compelling account of a human life, and I think almost no one does when they look at it in toto, when they see how much of human life they have to write off as not fully human, to hold on firmly to the idea that the baby in the womb is not human, and that a woman is endangered by the way she is specifically asymmetrically exposed to need. So what is the alternative? There's a quote I love by soon-to-be doctor of the church officially, but I think we can all take it as read that that's coming, I think next month, St. John Henry Newman, where he says, "We cannot be our own masters. We are God's property by creation, by redemption, by regeneration. He has a triple claim on us. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are our own? It may be thought so by the young and prosperous, but as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, that it is an unnatural state that may do for a while, but will not carry us on safely to the end. No, we are creatures, and as being such, we have two duties: to be resigned and to be thankful. But we live in a culture that increasingly tells us we have two rival duties if we want to pass as autonomous to the best of our ability. We have to obscure our dependence, and we have to privately resent it. I think this burden falls more heavily on women because women are more obviously and intimately exposed to the claims someone else can make on them. But it doesn't do men any favors either. Men, no less than women, are beloved by God. And when you think about the catechism of autonomy that we are offering ourselves, this catechism of hiding and resenting the ways in which we are creatures, the way in which our needs direct us to rely on the loves of others, we aren't just disordering our horizontal relationships with our brothers and sisters. We're doing violence against our vertical relationship with God. We can't, day by day, think that we are made undignified, degraded by needing things from other people, and then turn in prayer to God and say with genuine thanksgiving, "Thank you for making me. Thank you for redeeming me." In life, there's some hope, and people certainly strive for it, of paying people back, if not exactly in kind, then to the best of your ability. And if you can't gestate your mother to make things up for her, then at least you will take care of her in her old age, and hopefully the number of diapers changed on both ends winds up roughly equal. And she dies, with you having paid back your debt in full. Again, I think this is a mindset we slip into often without meaning to. This sense of our relationships are best when they're relationships between equals. And when they aren't, when at least we try and pass things on in some way. There's a really piercing example of this that I talk about in the book, which is a man who was a veteran whose wife was in assisted living. And every day he would drive down the road, a long drive, to be with her every single day. She had passed beyond the point where he could care for her himself, but every day he went and sat with her. And then one day, in from the Pacific Ocean, an atmospheric river dumped an inordinate amount of snow on him and his driveway. And so he went out once the storm had passed and started digging. And he dug until he'd injured his hands, but he couldn't move enough snow to clear the path to get his car out. And only then, after he had hurt himself in his attempt to get to his wife, did he post on Facebook in his neighborhood group that he needed help shoveling out. But he didn't lead with the fact that he needed help shoveling out or with how much he loved his wife. The opening words of his post that he sent to his neighbors were, "I am so ashamed that he could not dig out by himself." And when he posted it, people came to help, and it took a lot of people because it was a big snowstorm. But they shoveled him out, and he drove off again to visit his wife. But I get teared up thinking about him, waiting till he was hurt before he asked for help. Thinking that when his neighbors saw that his first priority in the storm was to go see his wife again, to make sure she didn't miss a day, that his neighbors would think badly of him for asking for their help. This man was a veteran. He'd spent his whole life in service trying to put his strength at the disposal of other people who needed him. And every day, he put what he could at the disposal of his wife, even if it was only his presence and his hand in hers. And I don't believe in his heart of hearts that he thought that when he joined the army, he was degrading civilians by offering his strength to help them. And I certainly don't believe that every day when he drove out to see his wife, he thought, she's so humiliated to see me here. Every time I show up here, it makes her feel ashamed. But he couldn't see himself as a recipient of the same love he offered others. He couldn't see a way that his own need was parallel to theirs, not degrading. That by having such a tremendous love for his wife, a love that wouldn't let him skip a day, he had made himself vulnerable. If he loved her less, he wouldn't have needed his neighbors. If he thought, I can wait a day or two till I go, this is too much for me, he wouldn't have needed them. He was made vulnerable by the largeness of his love, which exceeded his own strength. But we only can receive the full blessing of that love if we are willing to accept the help of others, if we are willing to love in ways that go beyond what we ourselves can supply, if we step out in faith and we make ourselves humble and say, simply, I need help to love this baby, to love my wife, to love my mother. I need help to love God. And I do not think that if we catechize ourselves by opening our requests for help with our shame, our humiliation, that we can say to God, my love here is so great that I need your help to give it force. My goal is to tell the truth, not just about who women are, but who women and men are. I think women are, to some sense, the canary in the coal mines of a society that makes an idol of autonomy. To imagine that we are not creatures, to imagine that our loves can be made small enough to be answered by our own strength, is not a lie that men or women can live comfortably within. The real difference between men and women here is that men can live within the lie for longer on average. But this is one of the differences that is back to being overlapping bell curves, not an absolute difference like reproduction. Women are exposed early to the ways that our mere existence makes us vulnerable to the needs someone else can place on us. But for a man to live an autonomous life can only happen when his life is narrow and when his life is lonely. So when I look at these questions of feminism and abortion, what I see is kind of the blaring fire, the signal that something is very wrong in how we conceive of the human person, male and female. That it's only by acknowledging that we are, in fact, very like the child in the womb, held by someone much greater than ourselves, sustained without regard for our merit, dependent, and because we rest in dependency, able to grow and thrive and flourish, that we can understand ourselves exactly, truthfully as we are, as the sons and daughters of God. Thank you. And I would love to take questions.
Excellent. Thank
priority
you.
is for anyone holding a baby, and then
Okay,
after that,
baby,
anyone
baby
else.
holders.
If you bring a baby, you get first question.
But don't feel the pressure.
Yeah, no pressure.
You've had plenty of pressure. Okay,
we
who would
can
like
move
to go?
on to people who did not bring a baby or who have not managed to get someone to hand them theirs in order to ask the first question.
Just raise your hand, and I'll come to you so that the folks who are listening on the live stream will be able to hear you.
Have I answered everything you want to know about relations between the sexes?
God bless you. Here we go.
I am very excited to read your book. I have a question for you about, is there something about human beings where we crave independence? And I have 3 kids who are now teenagers, but they were once little, and I do it myself is a big thing, which I'm sure you know from your own children. And my parents and mother-in-law are in their 80s and 90s, and I do it myself is a big thing. And it just feels like there is something innate in wanting to be independent. And I just wanted to hear what your reaction to that is.
No, my kids are 5.5, 3.5, and 1. So I hear a lot of this, and I delight in it, except when we have to get out the door. I think the correct interpretation of that drive is that we are called to develop the gifts God has given us to the fullest, to explore everything he has given us in making me, me, and you. And for a child, it's entirely proper to wonder, what else can I do? What is my body for? Can I jump off of this? Yes, but with consequences, right? But that, I think the fierce exploratory joy a child has is something grown-ups should have for their whole life to the best degree they can hold on to it. But where I think it goes awry is in the sense of not just that I should explore the edge of my mastery, I should see the range of what God has given me to do, but the idea that what I cannot do is either not worth doing or has to be attempted solely in private. And I think one place I draw a strong distinction here is that children are not ashamed to be amateurs, but adults are usually embarrassed not to have mastery of something if they're going to do it in public. I'm trying to take advantage of the fact that my kids love trying things and are willing to get better at them, to try doing things I'm bad at with them with really variable results. I'm not as good at drawing as my husband is, and I drew, I think, a penguin so badly that my daughter burst into tears, convinced I was doing it willfully. It's good for me to try doing it myself in that circumstance, not because I expect to achieve mastery, but because I want to explore what is it like to draw this. And I think grown-ups too rarely approach I do it myself with a spirit of curiosity and appreciation rather than a banked sense of shame.
A mother with a baby, folks online.
Do you have a sense, sort of in looking through sort of the intellectual history or sort of the anthropological record, when you see this like hyper value of autonomy, is that something that we're largely seeing like sort of in this sort of Western context, or like how early does that start? Has it been forever? And do you see a lot of this in other cultures as well?
So a full cross-cultural study is a little beyond my competencies. So I will give you a weakly sourced answer to that question. I think one thing that's interesting is we can use the historical record to look for evidence of people welcoming weakness when we look for, in archaeological digs, the bones of adults with severe disabilities. That's kind of the record, even if we don't always know the practices of the people where this person was buried. When we see someone who could not have walked on their own in a subsistence culture, buried as an adult, we know something about how this group welcomed the disabled. We don't know why they did it, right? But what I think is interesting is we can see there are times and places where we find those bodies and times and places where we don't. We currently live in a time where we are leaving a historical record that will be legible to the people who come after us as one where many of those bodies are missing. And they may also ask, just like you are, well, which was the practice that tipped them over into doing this? And I don't know if they'll be any surer than I am, but I think a large part of it is not having a habit of need, of being prosperous enough, which is a good thing, that we're able to cushion our own needs or make them private because we handle them as a financial transaction. I'm sick, so I pay someone to DoorDash me food, but I don't tell any of my friends that I'm sick or ask them to come visit me. That even though each of those decisions is itself allowed, right? I'm not saying you can't DoorDash soup when you're sick. They add up to a making need private in many ways and in many domains, and then revealing need becomes a higher stakes thing. Versus in poorer countries, it is just not a secret that you need people. You can't get away with this lie for very long at all. In America, we're prosperous enough to lie to ourselves for quite a long time until the lie becomes so large, we have trouble getting out of it.
I've been thinking a little bit about the relationship between this and sort of movements towards like healthy living. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of like shame that comes with being sick. And like I've experienced this in my own family with like grandparents getting sick and like sensing the shame they felt when you visit them by their bedside. And you see this in pop culture a lot. And in general, I think maybe men in particular struggle with this idea of like even being seen laying down, I think can be a weird thing. And like, so this idea of this vulnerability that comes with that. But I'm wondering how you might think about sort of new Maha, other sort of like, where the angle is like, you can almost take control of your own health and prevent any sort of sickness by just like working out enough and eating healthier and avoid all of this dependence. And I wonder if you think there's any sort of through line here between autonomy and health.
Yeah, there's a couple pieces of Maha that I'm very sympathetic to, and then some pieces where I'm like, no, this will make it worse. And I think that's one of the big pieces there. The idea of health is our natural state. And when you become unhealthy, something has gone wrong. Someone or something in your food has poisoned you. Like this slipping below into sickness, someone did this to you. It's not normal to be sick. And therefore, if you work hard, like you can get rid of the toxins, find the right doctor, and get back to your base state of being healthy. I think just descriptively, that's not true of human beings. What I like best is like a real sense of curiosity. How can we customize medicine? What does it mean for a doctor to get to spend time with you? I think is often the thing that people find most appealing about these fringy doctors, which is not even that they always have a solution. It's that they spend enough time listening to what is hard in your life, and then they appear to genuinely care and say, well, I want to try something for you. Whereas another doctor might go like, yes, maybe that's viral. I don't know. I only have 15 minutes that insurance will reimburse me for. And I want to say, like, the doctors also feel bad when they do that. But I think this sense of health is natural, sickness is weird, is just factually untrue, and it contributes to that sense of shame. And again, I think as Christians, we should always remember that our bodily health, to some degree, is an image. It reminds us of what our real, we're both embodied and spiritual, but it reminds us of the part we have a lighter grasp on. It is normal that we are sinners after the fall. You kind of have those same instincts of like, well, what's normal is being a good person, and then a couple people are bad people because they mess something up, and maybe they come back to being good people. But what we all are is wounded by sin. And to a very real extent, our bodily frailties are meant to remind us of how much we need the medicine of confession, you know, whether or not you're detoxing from anything on the medicine side. So this sense of, I am weaker than I want to be. My will doesn't do the things I want. Also, my body doesn't do the things I want. Like that bodily inescapable reality should point us back to our spiritual illness, and both should cause us to seek out the doctor who can care for us.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. I'm coming your way.
Hi, thank you. In a male normative society where we value people for their paychecks, for their strength, for their abilities against certain measures, you know, how do we change the scale or start looking at different things that, you know, that women might excel at more than men? I feel like that's always, you know, I stayed home with my children for 30 years. And I always feel like it's, well, you know, I just stay home, or, you know, I don't work, and, you know, I don't earn a paycheck. There's no objective gauge for people to value my contribution to society, even though I know inherently that I've given value to society. Like, what do we do as a culture to be able to like change the narrative away from this male normative perspective?
I think a big part of it is less that we need to kind of add the female norm alongside, and more that the culture that's going to be most welcoming to men and women is one that has a much wider tolerance for variability. Now, what that means, you know, in that case of being a stay-at-home mom, like some of that means just being more visible. Like a culture where there are more public spaces where people see you parenting is more stressful some of the time. It's more historically accurate that it's a very modern thing to be a stay-at-home parent alone in your house, rather than a parent primarily whose life revolves around your kids alongside other women whose lives revolve around their kids. And then you do have that sense of moment to moment, day to day. People see the work that I'm doing. They see that it's hard. And in fact, we share the burden a little bit. So to some extent, it's an unsatisfying answer. I think it's hard to get over when the work is invisible, and it's easier when it's shared and mingled in various ways. But I also think men benefit when we have a wider sense of what is normal, not just a strong male normal and then a strong female normal alongside it. Because for a lot of things, the way men and women relate is those overlapping bell curves where men are taller, women are shorter, men have higher grip strength, women have lower grip strength. But for a number of things, including questions of, well, things are valued in terms of a paycheck, is that overlapping bell curves? Is that where the male norm is preferred and the female norm is weaker? No, that's actually kind of a weirder way that men and women often relate on their distributions, which is that women have a narrower bell curve and men have a wider bell curve. So there are more men who succeed according to the measures of our society, holding a job, bringing home a big paycheck, etc. And then a lot of men who strongly fail by those measures. And this is why one of the reasons that male suicide rates are so much higher than for female ones. We kind of go like, what does it mean to be disvalued by society? There are a lot of ways, the most common ways women differ from men are indeed undervalued, but there are a lot of men who don't hit this target either, and there's more of them at the bottom of that curve than there are women at the bottom of the curve. And so to a very real extent, part of the goal is, how do we look at these very narrow stripes of success that more men are hitting relative to women, but women are closer on average, and then there's a lot of men down here where they're having the issues of deaths of despair, where men are more commonly going to say they have no friends, where men don't go to the doctor and then they die unless their wives nag them. And the book I'd recommend, which isn't as much about the societal part of this, but about the built environment, is Sarah Hendren's What Can a Body Do? She teaches about physical design for disability, and that's often not how can this be designed just differently so that there's another option, and more, how can I design this podium to be extremely adjustable? How can I design it to fit a really wide range of bodies rather than, will it fit one kind of body and now I'm going to add one more? I think most of our moves towards societal justice will look like what she describes as universal design. How do we design this job, this community to welcome a wider range of ways of living rather than it welcomed one and I'm adding one?
We have a question that came from the other audience.
Okay.
As you mentioned, women being far more familiar with their dependents, how do you think men could be more aware of their dependents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I regret that we can't stratify the internet questions based on whether you have a baby on your lap, but it's a very good question. I think men, because they are on average, physically stronger and more untouchable, have to make active choices so that they aren't caught out at the end, like that veteran, surprised by their need for other people. I think there's a couple ways you can approach this. I'll mention one for kind of younger guys growing up, and then one for more mature and marriageable guys. So I hope the younger one makes them more marriageable. I think it's important that when boys are becoming men, when they're teenagers, when they're full of energy, they're getting stronger, they have that same, your body is changing talk that makes them all uncomfortable. A core component of that, your body is changing, is you are now becoming stronger. You're on the upper part of that bell curve, on average, not all of you perhaps. And you may be wondering, what is all this extra strength for? Is it for impressing guys on gym Reddit? No. Is it for, loading all the mulch into your neighbor's yard who loves gardening but can't do it herself? Yes. And I think it's important that communities, I think it's easiest to do this through a parish community where there's a sense of geographical responsibility. Who is my strength for? What is this for? Why did God make me so gangly and weird right now? It's because, like Mrs. McGillicuddy specifically needs you. And if you don't know that, the priest will tell you. And I think this really honors that something is happening for boys at this point, not just that they're becoming loud or smelly. And we frame this all as like growing into puberty as the sense of being chaotic, out of control, too much, that very too muchness is meant for someone and their task is to figure out for whom. Now, when they get older, they're expected to figure out some of that for whom themselves, so they better get the practice of it early. And that's where I think there's a big difference between how women paradigmatically embrace or encounter dependence and how men do. That for women, the paradigmatic experience is pregnancy, of someone depends on me, I extend my body over them, but I don't really do it moment to moment consciously or actively. I don't think, you need more calcium, baby. Here comes the calcium I was saving for my bones, but it's for you now. And thank goodness, because then I'd have temptations of, actually, no, I'd like that back. But men very rarely have this experience of, because of someone's need, things just pour out of them without them having to will it. And I would point to the end of pregnancy as kind of the big example of this, because for me, it was an enormous relief that you just don't have to be good at labor because you can't stop having a baby. And that when I would go to the hospital for my first child, I thought, like, well, the nice thing is this is like a roller coaster. I can't get off. And if I'm not good enough at this or brave enough, none of that will stop the baby from being born. That's great. Now, my husband, who is sitting in the back, had no such promise. If me having a baby was too much for him, he couldn't rely on the fact that his body would just keep him there. If, when he needed to hold back my hair when I threw up, if he thought that was gross, he could technically run away. If he was tired or wanted a nap, he could fall asleep. I could not fall asleep. And so moment by moment, our shared participation in bringing our babies out of the womb and into the world, for me, depended on embracing the thing that was happening. And for him, depended on actively choosing the thing that was happening. And he did a very good job. But I think men don't have enough experiences of being needed in that way, of being told, yes, your job is running towards. You will not ever extend your body over someone to protect them or care for them inadvertently or involuntarily. You must seek out times where you can shelter someone else, lend them your strength, take care of them when they're sick. That is a distinctively masculine thing to do. It's what men have done in wars. Put their bodies on the line for someone else. But in a peaceful, prosperous society, that duty doesn't go away. It changes shape.
Is there any part of this conversation which is actually a theological dispute? So we have to
I hope not, honestly.
we all have to be aware of in which directions our religions tend to degrade. So some have noted that Catholicism tends to degrade in an authoritarian direction, and Protestantism tends to degrade towards radical individualism, which seems to be more of what you're concerned with when it comes to autonomy. And I can't help but notice that disproportionately, the number of people who are urging for recalibrations, revisitations when it comes to the sexual revolution, when it comes to feminism, are Catholic women. So do you think part of this is actually a theological problem?
Thank you for the question. The reason I said I hope not is, my hope is that the book is mostly saying things that are, I shouldn't say this before you buy it, trivially true. Because it is the easiest way for me to not stray into heresy. And I think we just spend a lot of our time needing to hear things that are already true, that technically we already know, and we need to hear them again to counter the ways we get pulled away from the truth. So my hope is it's not original enough to have theological problems. But I think that question of that horizontality and the verticality, right? Like the errors of looking too much at where are we peers versus where are we in a hierarchical relationship and what does that mean? I take the question, I think in America in particular, we don't have very many healthy models of verticality. And then you do get a lot of perversions of it. My daughter, who's 5, right, is learning about Christ as king of the universe. But based on the smattering of history she's picked up from us, she did have to ask, are there any good kings? Because she has learned through happenstance about King Herod and King Henry VIII, and also Julius Caesar, who wanted to be a king. And this isn't promising, right? So I think part of the challenge for working against that is America is a very egalitarian society and doesn't have very many models of what does a healthy verticality look like. I think the most natural one, the one that everyone has the chance of being exposed to, is the family, where there is a vertical relationship between parents and children, and there is an asymmetry between men and women. But I think many people grew up with a sense that cannot be good or is something to grow out of entirely. And especially when they have difficult or wounded experiences, then can't look at a call to any kind of sense of, well, how do you depend utterly on someone without thinking, you mean, how do I put myself at the mercy of someone who will hurt me? And I think the challenge is to think about where we have the opportunity to offer positive examples of verticality. God is the one vertical relationship we can trust utterly. But even then, we can have people who tell us untruths about God in a way that disorders our relationship with him. And I think the challenge is both within the family, within, the kind of community that does have to not be entirely egalitarian, whether that's a place of work or a community project where someone has to take charge of certain things and then other people work below them in a productive way. A theater company can be this, though it certainly isn't always, right? But someone is going to make the final call on this, and we're stronger together because we are not interacting in a totally flat way, is how we build up a sense of, how do you check which of these vertical relationships are healthy and fruitful, and how do you check which are abuse?
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, Leah. Thank you for your talk and for your time. I have read and enjoyed your Substack for a long time. And so I wanted to ask a bit about a reader participation project that you did in the lead up to the publication of this book, where you invited readers to think about ways in which they could invite people to be vulnerable and ask people in their community for certain kinds of help. And so I'm so curious, were there particular things that other people found or that you found or that you would recommend as we think about how we can get better at asking other people for help?
Yes, so I ran bingo in August, and it was mutual dependence bingo. And I had a bingo board of different things you could do for someone else or ask them to do for you. And I told people that if they did this, I would send everyone who got a bingo the first chapter of the book, and I would send 2 people of the bingoers the full book sneakily ahead of time, which is a lot of fun. And it meant to have a range of things you could do, where it's everything from like pick up a prescription for someone to, have someone over in your messy house, right? Like what makes you vulnerable to others? And, different people gravitate to different things. And I had a mix of things you could ask for and things you could give. And I had several people email me after the first week or after the first 2 weeks of that month and going like, I notice I have checked off all the things I can do for other people, but I have checked off none of the things that other people can do for me. And I think the reason that happens, and the reason I said there were a mix of both, and you shouldn't do that in the long term, is because it feels easier to offer help from a position of strength, to be magnanimous. But I really encourage folks, and I encourage all of you, like in this next coming week, to pick one thing you ask for help with that maybe even you could manage on your own, but that you could accept someone else's help on. That difference between door dashing when you're sick for saying, I am sick, please come take care of me, knowing that your friend knows you could DoorDash, right? I think the simplest way of doing this, so especially if you get to, let's see, today is Tuesday, so if you're late Monday night, you realize you haven't done this, and I did ask you. The simplest way of asking for help is to ask someone to pray for you. And if possible, to tell them what you need prayers for. I think this is one of the biggest ways that we can share our vulnerability with each other. And what's really startling to me is that I try and make it a rule to never part from someone who's a Christian when I see them without asking, what can I pray for you? And often I may have spent 2 hours with someone hanging out, going on a walk, hanging out with our kids. We've talked about a lot, and it's not till that last moment that I learn that their dad is waiting for the results of his cancer scan, because it didn't come up naturally until I asked about prayer. So I think it's in that moment when we open ourselves and our relationship up to God, where it's obvious our own strength is not all that's on the table here, that we get the chance to ask more confidently for help, knowing our friend can help us, and to give other people the courage to make their real needs known. When I ran the bingo, I got a number of kind of funny stories and touching stories, and the two that meant the most to me is one woman who said that partway through August, she lost her husband. That when she woke up, he was dead in the bed beside her. And that she appreciated the bingo as a reason to do things, to have an ordering to her days, a set of things to do. And I heard almost the exact same thing from a woman who had recently had a baby and was struggling with postpartum depression. That having in her own mind the idea of, I should do things, I should see people, versus I've got to do things or I won't have filled out this bingo board, right? Gave her a permission structure. I think the reason people needed that to some extent, needed that push in extreme situations and in small ones for the folks who didn't ask for help naturally, is because even you, the people who have voluntarily showed up to hear a talk about a book called The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto, who have braved all 4 of those words, are still catechized by a culture of autonomy and may find it hard to ask for help. And it's by making those asks, by looking at the book to give you courage if it helps, right? By saying, okay, this actually, it feels weird because it is weird. It feels countercultural because it is countercultural. But it's very hard to live a full, vibrantly pro-life life without testifying to others that you don't find weakness bad or dehumanizing by revealing your own. And so it's Tuesday night. You guys all have a week to make that request.
Leah Libresco Sargeant. And thank you all for joining us here in this room and those who are online. I invite you to come out, purchase many of the fine books that have been written by the Sargeant family. Alexi, your books is right there, so he can sign it as well. So we're just going to head out. We're having a little light happy hour out there. So Gerard's tending bar. There's some little munchies, and Kevin's bringing up books. So if there's anything you need and you want to continue the conversation, she'll be out there. So thank you, and come back. We have some great programs that are coming up, including an event with Father Gregory Pine, Kevin Wells, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see them up. We just have been busy. So it'll be up very soon. Thank you for being here. God bless you. And happy feast of Our Lady of the Rosary.
Amen.